You think you know medieval history? Think again. Forget the knights and kings for a moment, and step into a treacherous world where empresses, queens, and their silent machinations shaped an entire continent. But how much power did they truly wield? Welcome to my channel Words of Time, and stay with me to find out. The Hohenstaufen women weren't just wives and mothers. They were players in a deadly game, and the stakes were nothing less than an empire. The Hohenstaufen dynasty has long been remembered for its rulers, their imperial ambitions, and the great conflicts that shaped the medieval Holy Roman Empire. Yet behind the emperors who carried swords and crowns were women whose presence shaped politics, culture, and dynastic legacy in ways that history often overlooks. To understand the Hohenstaufen story, one must also look at the women who influenced courts, guided kingdoms, and preserved power through diplomacy, marriage, and faith. Their lives reveal not only the complexity of medieval politics, but also the quiet strength required to survive and thrive in an age of endless rivalry. The Hohenstaufen era stretched across the 12th and 13th centuries, a time of fierce struggles between emperors and popes, between the authority of the empire and the independence of emerging states. The dynasty began its rise under Frederick Barbarossa, who brought prestige and might to the German throne. His campaigns, both in Italy and against rival powers within the empire, marked an age of ambition and conflict. But as he fought for dominion, women in his family served as his allies, diplomats, and anchors. In their hands, the empire was not only a realm of soldiers and laws, but also of lineage, influence, and culture. Frederick Barbarossa's wife, Beatrice of Burgundy, stood as a remarkable figure of her time. Born into the House of Burgundy, she brought with her lands, alliances, and legitimacy that strengthened the emperor's position in the western regions of the empire. Their marriage was not merely a union of hearts, but one of political strategy, a common reality in medieval dynastic politics. Yet Beatrice's life reflected more than alliance building. As empress, she managed territories, corresponded with nobles, and represented imperial dignity at court. She was described as educated, graceful, and capable of maintaining order within her household while supporting her husband's vision of unity. Her presence in Italy during imperial campaigns offered stability to the Hohenstaufen cause, for she acted as both symbol and participant in the empire's vast network of power. From Beatrice came a lineage that extended the Hohenstaufen reach beyond the German heartlands. Their children married into noble houses across Europe, binding the dynasty to both French and Spanish realms. Through these alliances, the Hohenstaufen name became part of an international network that connected courts from Burgundy to Sicily. Yet such marriages also placed women in challenging positions, torn between loyalty to their birth families and their new political environments. Hohenstaufen daughters learned early that influence often came not from open power, but from the subtle art of persuasion, negotiation, and survival. When Frederick Barbarossa's son, Henry VI, ascended the throne, his wife, Constance of Sicily, became one of the most fascinating figures in medieval history. She was the heiress of the Norman kings of Sicily and brought with her a southern kingdom rich in culture, art, and wealth. Her marriage to Henry united northern imperial power with the southern Mediterranean world, forming a bridge between German rule and the diverse Sicilian court, where Greek, Arab, and Latin traditions mixed. Constance's role was far from passive. When Henry sought to assert his claim to Sicily, she faced hostility from local nobles who viewed her as a foreign influence. Yet her legitimacy as the rightful ruler of the Sicilian line gave her strength. After Henry's death, she became regent for their young son, Frederick II, protecting his inheritance against rivals who wished to seize control. As regent, Constance demonstrated both intelligence and courage. She understood that her son's future depended on balancing the interests of the Sicilian nobility with the authority of the German crown. Her rule was marked by diplomacy and restraint, avoiding unnecessary wars and ensuring stability during a vulnerable transition. Constance's efforts ensured that her son would survive to become one of the most remarkable rulers of the medieval world. In her, we see the prototype of the Hohenstaufen woman, loyal yet independent, pragmatic yet guided by duty. Frederick II, often called Stupor Mundi, or the wonder of the world, inherited from his mother not only the throne, but a deep respect for culture and learning. While his reign has been studied for its innovations in governance, law, and science, the women in his orbit also deserve attention. His first wife, Constance of Aragon, linked the empire to the powerful Aragonese dynasty, strengthening ties with the Iberian Peninsula. Though her marriage to Frederick was short-lived, her position reinforced the strategic nature of dynastic unions. After her death, Frederick married Isabella, daughter of John of Brienne, the King of Jerusalem. Through Isabella, he acquired the title of King of Jerusalem, further extending his reach into the eastern Mediterranean. Their marriage brought him into contact with the politics of the Crusader states, where religious and territorial conflicts intertwined. Isabella, though young and often overshadowed by her husband's reputation, played her part as a symbolic bridge between European and Eastern worlds. Frederick's court in Sicily became a beacon of intellectual life, drawing poets, scholars, and artists from across Europe and the Arab world. The women connected to him, wives, mistresses, and daughters, participated in this vibrant environment. Some were patrons of literature, while others corresponded with philosophers or managed estates that supported the court's cultural endeavors. The emperor's daughter, Margaret of Sicily, for example, lived in a world shaped by learning and art. She married into the Marquises of Monferrato, continuing the Hohenstaufen tradition of linking dynastic strategy with cultural patronage. Among the later generations, one of the most intriguing women was Manfred's wife, Helena Angelina Decana, a Greek princess who married into the Hohenstaufen line during a period of decline and turmoil. Her presence brought an element of Byzantine elegance to the Sicilian court, which had already absorbed elements of Norman, Arab, and Latin cultures. When Manfred's rule collapsed after his defeat at Benevento, Helena's fate reflected the tragedy that often befell women caught in the tides of dynastic collapse. Captured and imprisoned, she endured hardship with dignity, representing the quiet resilience of those who lived through the fall of empires. The women of the Hohenstaufen family were not only queens and empresses, but also intermediaries in the broader political and spiritual networks of medieval Europe. Some entered convents, where they wielded religious influence. Others acted as guardians of family memory, commissioning chronicles and endowing churches that carried the family's name into posterity. They shaped not only the image of their dynasty, but the cultural landscape of their time. Their roles remind us that power in the Middle Ages was rarely confined to the battlefield or the throne room. It extended into homes, monasteries, and courts, where women managed correspondence, property, and diplomacy. One of the most powerful aspects of their legacy lies in how they navigated an environment that was overwhelmingly male-dominated. The medieval world often confined women's roles to marriage and motherhood, yet within those boundaries, they found ways to exercise agency. Empresses like Beatrice of Burgundy and Constance of Sicily influenced succession, foreign policy, and cultural development. Their patronage of art, architecture, and literature preserved a vision of civilization even amid warfare and political strife. Through them, the Hohenstaufen court became more than a center of military command. It became a meeting place of languages, traditions, and ideas. The 12th and 13th centuries were also times of ideological struggle between secular and spiritual power. The Hohenstaufens were often in conflict with the papacy, and this tension affected the women as much as the men. Constance of Sicily, for instance, had to negotiate with the papal court to secure her son's inheritance. Her intelligence allowed her to maintain a careful balance between asserting imperial rights and avoiding open confrontation with the church. Later, Frederick II's excommunication and his wars with the papacy placed his wives and children in positions of great uncertainty. Some were used as political pawns, while others became exiles or hostages. Yet even in these hardships, the dignity with which many Hohenstaufen women bore their fate added to the dynasty's aura of tragic grandeur. When examining the Hohenstaufen story, it becomes clear that the women's influence extended beyond politics. They helped shape the moral and emotional tone of the dynasty. Their letters and records reveal care for family unity, concern for justice, and devotion to education and faith. Beatrice's efforts to maintain family harmony, Constance's careful regency, and Isabella's role in bridging cultures all reveal a shared commitment to the stability of the empire. In a world where wars could erase kingdoms overnight, their persistence kept the Hohenstaufen legacy alive even after the dynasty fell from power. The end of the Hohenstaufen line came with tragedy and defeat. Manfred's fall, Conradin's execution, and the loss of imperial authority in Italy marked the close of an era. Yet the influence of the Hohenstaufen women did not vanish. Their descendants through marriage continued to shape European history in subtle ways. Their cultural contributions endured in architecture, literature, and memory. The castles, cathedrals, and manuscripts that remain from their time carry traces of their taste and values. Through their patronage, the ideals of chivalry, learning, and refinement spread across Europe. To look beyond the throne is to recognize the invisible architecture of power that women helped construct. They were mediators between courts, keepers of alliances, and protectors of dynastic continuity. Their marriages connected empires. Their regencies held them together. They served as educators of princes and as models of faith in a world defined by instability. While their names are less often spoken than those of the emperors, their influence shaped the very foundations on which the Hohenstaufen dynasty stood. The Hohenstaufen women remind us that history is not made by rulers alone, but by those who supported, counseled, and challenged them. They embodied the strength of endurance rather than conquest, the wisdom of restraint rather than aggression. Their lives were marked by duty and often by sorrow, yet they left behind a legacy of resilience and grace. The dynasty's grandeur owed as much to their quiet strength as to the military might of its kings. In tracing their stories, we see how the medieval world, for all its violence and ambition, still depended on human relationships built through trust, loyalty, and care. The empress who managed estates, the regent who safeguarded her son's throne, the patron who nurtured poets, and the widow who defended her family's honor all played roles in sustaining a civilization that might otherwise have collapsed under its own conflicts. The women of the Hohenstaufen family reveal the depth and complexity of female influence at a time when power was thought to belong only to men. Their memory survives in chronicles, letters, and the architecture of their time, but more importantly, in the understanding that empire was never merely a man's world. It was also shaped by women who understood the delicate balance between force and diplomacy, faith and ambition, love and loyalty. The Hohenstaufen dynasty's story, when told fully, becomes not just a tale of emperors and wars, but a testament to partnership, intelligence, and endurance. These women, often hidden behind the grandeur of the imperial title, were the living pulse of the dynasty, guiding it through triumph and tragedy alike. Their lives remind us that the history of power is incomplete without the history of those who sustained it. The Hohenstaufen women stood not only behind their emperors, but beside them, and at times, above them in wisdom and courage. To understand their world is to understand that leadership in the Middle Ages came in many forms, and that influence was not always measured by the crown one wore, but by the legacy one left behind. Constance of Sicily occupies a unique and powerful place in medieval history, her story woven into the great tapestry of the Hohenstaufen dynasty. She was born into the royal Norman line of Sicily, a kingdom that stood at the crossroads of the Mediterranean world. Her life was marked by politics, survival, and extraordinary intelligence. Unlike many women of her time, she did not come to power through gradual inheritance or by marriage alone. She was born with the right to rule, a right that carried both privilege and peril. Her journey from a Norman princess to Holy Roman Empress, and then to the protector of her son's imperial inheritance, stands as one of the most remarkable tales of political resilience in the medieval age. Constance was the posthumous daughter of Roger II, the great Norman king of Sicily, who built a diverse and flourishing kingdom where Latin, Greek, and Arab cultures coexisted. Sicily under the Normans was a jewel of the Mediterranean, a realm where trade, art, and learning met from every corner of the known world. Constance's early life, however, was shaped by distance from power. As the youngest child of a large royal family, she was not expected to rule. Her older brothers William I and William II stood before her in succession, and she spent much of her youth in relative quiet, away from the court's intrigues. According to later chroniclers, she was even placed in a convent, a reflection of how little anyone expected her to enter politics. The calm of her early years did not last. As fate would have it, the Norman royal line began to falter. Her brothers died without heirs, and the kingdom faced uncertainty. The Sicilian nobles, fearing foreign influence and internal strife, sought stability through new leadership. It was then that Constance, now a mature woman, found herself drawn back into the political stage. Her claim as the legitimate heir to the Sicilian throne was undeniable. Yet her ascension was not straightforward. Sicily was a land coveted by many, including the papacy and the powerful houses of Europe. Her marriage would therefore determine the future of the kingdom. The choice of husband would alter the course of European history. Constance was betrothed to Henry, son of Frederick Barbarossa, the great Hohenstaufen emperor. The union was not born of affection, but of strategy. By joining the imperial and Sicilian crowns, Europe's political map was reshaped. For Henry, the marriage offered control over a rich and strategically placed kingdom. For Constance, it was both a duty and a gamble, for marrying into the empire would place her between two powerful worlds: the independent Sicilian monarchy she inherited and the vast, often turbulent realm of the German emperors. When she married Henry, she was no young bride. At nearly 30 years old, she entered a marriage that demanded strength and understanding rather than youthful passion. The ceremony in Milan in the late 12th century was magnificent, a reflection of the union's significance. Constance became Holy Roman Empress, a title that carried immense prestige, but also bound her to an empire in constant conflict with the papacy and rebellious nobles. Her role was both partner and mediator, a bridge between two realms whose union could bring either greatness or disaster. Constance's time as empress revealed her intelligence and adaptability. While Henry sought to extend imperial control into southern Italy and Sicily, she acted as a voice of moderation. The Sicilians viewed the German presence with suspicion, seeing the emperor's forces as foreign occupiers. Constance, understanding her people's sentiment, sought to balance imperial ambition with local loyalty. She became a key intermediary, easing tensions when possible and ensuring that the Sicilian crown retained its distinct identity. Her position, however, grew precarious when Henry's rule met resistance in the south. Local uprisings and papal opposition tested their strength. During one of Henry's campaigns in Sicily, Constance was briefly captured by her political opponents, a humiliating episode that could have ended her influence. Yet her dignity and composure impressed even her captors, and she was eventually released. The incident hardened her resolve and revealed her remarkable resilience. It also deepened her understanding of the political dangers surrounding her, teaching her that survival depended as much on patience and diplomacy as on force. In the final years of Henry's life, Constance gave birth to their only child, a boy who would later become Frederick II. The birth of a male heir secured the continuity of both dynasties, yet it also placed enormous pressure on her shoulders. When Henry died unexpectedly, Constance faced the greatest challenge of her life. She was now a widow in a world of competing ambitions, the mother of an infant who was heir not only to the Kingdom of Sicily, but to the entire Holy Roman Empire. Her husband's death left her surrounded by adversaries: German princes who wished to control her son, Sicilian nobles wary of foreign domination, and the papacy determined to limit imperial influence in Italy. Constance's response to this crisis displayed the full measure of her political genius. Instead of fleeing or surrendering her son's rights, she asserted her authority as regent of Sicily. She acted swiftly to expel the remaining German forces from the island, ensuring that the local population would view her government as native rather than foreign. By distancing herself from the imperial administration, she restored trust among the Sicilian nobility and clergy. At the same time, she made peace with the papacy, recognizing the Pope's overlordship of Sicily in exchange for papal protection of her son's inheritance. This was a masterstroke of diplomacy. Constance understood that in the game of survival, compromise often ensured victory. Her regency was marked by intelligence, prudence, and deep awareness of the complex political web surrounding Sicily. She reorganized the administration, strengthened justice, and revived the structures her Norman ancestors had built. Her rule was characterized by restraint and order, qualities rare in a time of upheaval. Though her regency lasted only a few years before her death, the stability she created allowed her son to inherit a secure and unified realm. Without her leadership, the young Frederick would likely have been swallowed by the rival factions that surrounded him. Her correspondence and recorded decrees reveal a woman of authority and insight. She did not act as a figurehead but as a true ruler, issuing edicts in her own name and overseeing both political and judicial matters. She was known for her fairness and her ability to balance firmness with compassion. Her decisions were guided by both practicality and a sense of justice rooted in her understanding of the diverse cultures of Sicily. Greek, Arab, and Latin traditions coexisted under her rule as they had under her father's, and she preserved that multicultural harmony that made the kingdom unique. Constance's relationship with the papacy, while strategic, also reflected her understanding of religious and political realities. The Church was the most powerful institution in Europe, and to defy it would have been folly. Yet she managed to protect her son's interests without yielding the essence of her authority. She recognized Pope Innocent as the guardian of her child, but ensured that the papal role would not eclipse her own regency. This balance between submission and control showed her remarkable skill in negotiating power within the limits imposed upon medieval women. Her death, which came only a few years after Henry's, was a significant loss to the Sicilian kingdom and the Hohenstaufen dynasty. She passed away in Palermo, leaving behind a legacy of order and foresight. Before her death, she arranged for her son to be placed under papal guardianship, hoping that the church would protect him until he came of age. Her choice demonstrated once again her long-term vision. She had secured peace for Sicily, safeguarded her son's inheritance, and built a foundation upon which Frederick II would later construct his empire. The consequences of her political strategy were far-reaching. Her decision to link Sicily with the papacy allowed Frederick to mature in safety, receiving an education that blended Latin scholarship, Arab science, and Norman statecraft. When he came of age, he emerged as one of the most brilliant rulers of the Middle Ages, a man of intellect, curiosity, and tolerance. Much of what made him exceptional had its roots in the world his mother had preserved for him. Constance's foresight ensured that the Hohenstaufen legacy would not end with her husband's death, but would instead reach its greatest height through their son. In the wider scope of history, Constance's reign also marked a transition from Norman to Hohenstaufen rule in southern Italy. Through her, the cultural achievements of Norman Sicily were passed to the new imperial dynasty. The architectural, artistic, and administrative traditions of the Normans blended with the imperial ideals of the Hohenstaufen, creating a unique synthesis that defined Frederick's later court. Without her bridging influence, this union of northern and southern European cultures might never have occurred. Her life also challenges modern assumptions about medieval women's limitations. Though constrained by custom and law, she wielded power with intelligence and subtlety. She navigated male-dominated political systems without open rebellion, using persuasion and legitimacy to assert control. She neither sought to overturn the structures around her nor submitted blindly to them. Instead, she mastered them. Her success lay in her ability to understand the world as it was and to turn its expectations to her advantage. Even in the chronicler's accounts, which often diminished women's roles, Constance appears as a figure of respect and strength. Contemporary writers described her as dignified, intelligent, and wise. They noted her calm under pressure and her ability to command loyalty. Some even compared her prudence to that of the most capable male rulers of her time. Her story was remembered not as a tale of tragedy, but as an example of how intellect and patience could prevail over chaos. Her influence continued to shape the policies of her descendants. Frederick's later emphasis on law, governance, and culture reflected the lessons of stability and tolerance that his mother embodied. His understanding of the Mediterranean's complexity, his respect for learning, and his pragmatic approach to religion can all be traced to the environment Constance fostered. She had understood that true strength came not from conquest alone, but from the capacity to govern justly and preserve harmony among diverse peoples. The legacy of Constance also lived on in how later generations viewed the Hohenstaufen dynasty. While her husband was remembered for ambition and conquest, she was remembered for prudence and preservation. Together, they represented the dual nature of power, one through expansion, the other through endurance. It was this balance that allowed their lineage to achieve greatness, even in the face of constant opposition. Her life speaks to the wider theme of women's political agency in the medieval world. Though often excluded from formal authority, women like Constance wielded influence through regency, diplomacy, and family networks. Their decisions could shape empires and alter the course of history, even if chroniclers seldom recorded their full achievements. Constance stands as a model of such power. She did not command armies or wage wars, yet she changed the fate of kingdoms through intelligence and patience. Her actions also underline the deep connection between personal strength and public duty. Every choice she made, whether accepting her marriage to Henry, managing her regency, or negotiating with the papacy, was guided by a sense of obligation to her lineage and her people. She viewed power not as privilege but as responsibility, an attitude that distinguished her from many of her contemporaries. The memory of Empress Constance endured long after the Hohenstaufen dynasty fell. In Sicily, her name was linked with justice and order. Later generations of chroniclers, both German and Italian, recognized her as one of the key figures who preserved the dynasty's survival. Even as her son's reign brought new glory and controversy to the empire, her spirit lingered as the foundation upon which his achievements rested. When seen as part of the larger Hohenstaufen story, Constance's life completes the picture of a dynasty that was both powerful and fragile. The emperors who carried swords relied on the wisdom of women who understood the subtler forms of power. Beatrice of Burgundy provided stability to Frederick Barbarossa's reign, while Constance of Sicily secured the dynasty's survival through diplomacy and foresight. Each woman embodied a different aspect of influence, one through unity, the other through endurance. Constance's achievements remind us that legacy is not only built through conquest, but through continuity. Her careful management of Sicily ensured that the kingdom remained strong even after her death. Her diplomatic compromise with the papacy bought her son the time he needed to grow into his role. Her preservation of Norman traditions kept alive a cultural richness that would later define Frederick's court. All of these outcomes stemmed from her quiet but decisive actions during a few critical years of regency. The mark she left on history is one of quiet greatness. While others sought glory through war or domination, she found it in the preservation of peace and justice. Her understanding of power was deeply human, grounded in patience, empathy, and foresight. She recognized that true leadership lies not in the loud display of authority, but in the steady guidance that ensures a people's survival through uncertainty. The Hohenstaufen dynasty, remembered for its emperors and its grand ambitions, would not have endured without her. She was its anchor during its most vulnerable moment, the bridge between its past and its future. Her wisdom allowed the flame of the dynasty to burn long enough for her son to illuminate the world with his intellect and vision. In every sense, the empire she left behind was her creation as much as it was her husband's or her son's. Constance of Sicily remains a testament to the enduring strength of character, the kind that operates quietly but leaves an unshakable mark on history. She lived in a world that offered little space for women to lead, yet she led with unmatched skill. Her reign was brief but decisive, her legacy subtle yet profound. Through diplomacy, courage, and faith, she transformed vulnerability into stability and ensured that the Hohenstaufen name would shine long after her own time had passed. Her story continues the lineage of remarkable women who defined the dynasty from behind the throne and beside it. Together, they remind us that power is not confined to the crown or the sword. It also lives in the mind that plans, the heart that endures, and the hand that steadies a realm in turmoil. Constance embodied all of these, and through her, the spirit of the Hohenstaufen dynasty found its greatest guardian. Irene Angelina's life unfolded at the intersection of empires, faiths, and cultures, a story that reveals the constant negotiation between personal fate and political necessity. Her path from a Byzantine princess to Queen of Germany and Sicily connects the Hohenstaufen dynasty to the grand heritage of the Eastern Roman Empire. Her journey, though shaped by political design, stands as a testament to strength, endurance, and the quiet influence that women wielded in the face of relentless change. Through her experiences, one can trace not only the reach of Hohenstaufen ambition, but also the deep human cost of dynastic politics in the Middle Ages. Born into the Byzantine imperial family, Irene was the daughter of Isaac II Angelos, the ruler of Constantinople. The Byzantine court in which she grew up was a world of brilliance and intrigue. Surrounded by scholars, clerics, and courtiers, she was trained in languages, faith, and the intricate etiquette of empire. Yet behind the splendor lay uncertainty. The Byzantine Empire of her time was weakened by internal strife and external threats, its once vast territories reduced by divisions among rival factions. As a daughter of the emperor, Irene was both privileged and vulnerable. Her value to her family and empire rested largely on her potential as a bride who could cement alliances with powerful foreign rulers. From an early age, she understood that her destiny would not be her own to choose. Her beauty, education, and noble birth made her a desirable match for European monarchs seeking to connect their lines to the ancient prestige of Byzantium. To Western Europe, the Byzantine Empire still represented the seat of the old Roman legacy, a bridge between the Latin West and the Greek East. The prospect of uniting a princess of that lineage with the rising power of the Hohenstaufens offered immense political promise. The marriage would link the Holy Roman Empire to the Eastern Empire in a symbolic gesture of unity between two Christian worlds divided by theology and geography. Irene's marriage was arranged to Philip of Swabia, the youngest son of Frederick Barbarossa and brother to Emperor Henry VI. The match was one of diplomacy rather than romance, yet it reflected the far-reaching ambition of the Hohenstaufen family. For the Byzantines, it provided an alliance with a dynasty whose power stretched across Germany and Italy. For the Hohenstaufens, it offered legitimacy through association with the imperial house of Constantinople. When she left her homeland to travel west, Irene entered a world vastly different from the one she had known. The journey from Constantinople to the German lands was not merely a physical passage, but a cultural transformation. She left behind the refined court of Byzantium, where Greek was the language of state and religion intertwined with ceremony, for a harsher and more fragmented realm where political authority was contested among princes and bishops. Upon arriving in the West, she took the name Maria, in keeping with the Latin custom of renaming foreign brides. Despite the change of name, she never abandoned her Eastern identity entirely. Her bearing, manner, and education marked her as distinct, and she became a living symbol of the connection between East and West. Her marriage to Philip brought her into the very heart of the Hohenstaufen struggle for dominance. The period following Emperor Henry's death was one of great uncertainty. The German princes were divided over succession, and the unity of the empire hung in the balance. Philip, as Henry's brother, emerged as one of the principal claimants to the throne, but his rule faced fierce opposition from rival nobles who backed Otto of Brunswick, a member of the Welf family. In this turbulent political landscape, Irene stood beside her husband not merely as queen, but as a partner in endurance and diplomacy. The union between Irene and Philip was, by all accounts, a stable and affectionate one, an exception among many politically arranged marriages of the era. Chroniclers described Philip's admiration for his wife's intelligence, grace, and learning. She bore him several children, ensuring the continuation of the Hohenstaufen line at a time when succession was uncertain. Through her, the dynasty's future was secured not just by blood, but by the prestige that her Byzantine heritage conferred. Her sons and daughters carried both the legacy of the German emperors and the lineage of the ancient Roman East, a combination that elevated the family's image across Europe. Her presence at the German court introduced elements of Byzantine refinement and culture to a setting more accustomed to military ceremony than philosophical discourse. She was known to encourage learning and religious devotion, and her manner of dress and conduct brought a touch of Constantinople's sophistication to the Hohenstaufen world. Her role, however, extended far beyond that of a decorative consort. As queen, she managed estates, oversaw the upbringing of her children, and maintained correspondence with both secular and clerical figures. She understood that her position was as much a symbol of alliance as it was a function of governance. Her life, however, was shadowed by the unending turbulence that defined the Hohenstaufen struggle for power. The years of her marriage were filled with political instability and warfare. Philip's claim to the throne was contested continuously, and his reign was marked by both diplomacy and bloodshed. Irene's role in this period required extraordinary composure. She navigated the rivalries of German princes and the delicate relations with the papacy, which viewed the Hohenstaufen power with suspicion. Despite her foreign origin, she won respect among many of the empire's nobility through her dignity and restraint. The tragedy that struck her family would change her life forever. In the early 13th century, Philip was assassinated by Otto of Wittelsbach, a count who had once been his ally. The murder shocked the empire, leaving Irene widowed and her children fatherless in a world of shifting loyalties. The death of her husband not only shattered her personal life, but also destabilized the political structure she had helped uphold. As a foreign-born queen, her position now became precarious. The German court was no place for a widow without powerful protectors, and the rival factions within the empire viewed her as both a potential asset and a liability. Yet Irene did not collapse under grief or isolation. She acted with dignity and foresight, dedicating herself to securing her children's safety and their rightful inheritance. Her eldest daughter, Beatrice, would later marry into the Capetian line of France, linking the Hohenstaufen blood to one of the most powerful dynasties of Western Europe. Through such alliances, Irene ensured that her husband's lineage would survive beyond the German borders. She understood the importance of marriage diplomacy, just as her own had been arranged to bridge empires. Her wisdom in these matters reflected her upbringing in the Byzantine court, where politics and family were always intertwined. Her life after Philip's death was marked by exile and endurance. She withdrew from the political heart of the empire, but remained connected through her children and supporters. She lived long enough to witness the continuing struggles of the Hohenstaufen dynasty, which persisted in its conflicts with both the papacy and the Welfs. Her role in those later years was quieter, but no less significant. She served as a living reminder of the dynasty's connection to Byzantium, and her counsel was sought by those who valued experience over ambition. The personal hardships she endured during this period were immense. The loss of her husband was followed by the decline of her own health, and she faced the loneliness of a queen without a throne. Yet her endurance inspired admiration even among those who had once opposed her husband. Chroniclers noted her piety and her devotion to her children, qualities that stood in contrast to the brutality of the age. Her strength came not from wielding armies or commanding states, but from her steadfastness in the face of loss. Her Byzantine upbringing gave her a profound sense of fate and faith, and it was this that allowed her to face adversity without bitterness. In the Byzantine world, where emperors rose and fell with alarming frequency, survival itself was a form of victory. Irene embodied that lesson in the Western world. Her survival ensured the continuation of a bloodline that would shape European history for generations. Through her descendants, the cultural and political heritage of Byzantium merged with the ambitions of the Hohenstaufen Empire, creating a legacy that outlived both realms. Her life also reflected the deep cultural contrasts and connections between the East and West. As a Byzantine princess, she carried with her traditions of courtly ceremony, theological debate, and artistic refinement. In Germany, she encountered a society built on feudal loyalty, martial valor, and papal rivalry. Her ability to adapt to these differences demonstrated extraordinary intelligence. She never abandoned her roots, yet she learned to move within a foreign system with grace. She became a bridge between two civilizations that often misunderstood each other. Irene's influence extended beyond her own lifetime through the children she bore and the alliances they formed. Her daughters married into powerful European houses, spreading Byzantine influence across the continent. Her son, Frederick of Swabia, inherited his father's spirit and his mother's resilience, though his life too would be marked by the conflicts that haunted the Hohenstaufen line. Through these descendants, the memory of Irene Angelina persisted not as a footnote to her husband's reign, but as a foundational link in the dynasty's continuity. Her role in shaping the Hohenstaufen identity was subtle but profound. While her husband and his brothers fought for crowns and territories, she provided the legitimacy and stability that only lineage could grant. Her presence reinforced the dynasty's claim to universal authority by uniting Western imperial ambition with Eastern imperial heritage. In a time when bloodlines determined political power, her ancestry was both weapon and shield. The Hohenstaufens could now trace their family line to both the Holy Roman Empire and the Byzantine court, a symbolic unification of Christendom's two halves. Her story also offers insight into the broader experience of royal women in medieval Europe. They were often portrayed as pawns in political games, their lives dictated by the ambitions of men. Yet Irene's life demonstrates that even within these constraints, women could exercise agency. Her decisions in marriage, motherhood, and widowhood shaped the fate of kingdoms. She used the tools available to her, family, alliance, faith, to influence events in ways that might not appear dramatic in chronicles, but proved decisive in the long arc of history. The union of Irene and Philip also symbolizes the fusion of ideals between East and West. Byzantium represented continuity, learning, and theological sophistication. The Hohenstaufen Empire represented vigor, ambition, and reform. Together, they embodied two strands of the medieval imagination, one rooted in preservation, the other in conquest. Through their marriage, those traditions met, and though the unity was fleeting, its impact on European consciousness endured. The artistic and intellectual flowering that characterized later Hohenstaufen courts owed something to the Byzantine sensibility that Irene brought with her. Her personal story of survival in a world of shifting alliances and constant danger echoes the experiences of other Hohenstaufen women who came before her. Like Constance of Sicily, she faced widowhood and political peril with courage. Both women used diplomacy to secure their children's futures, both balanced pride with prudence, and both transformed moments of personal loss into acts of dynastic preservation. They embodied the endurance that allowed the dynasty to survive its darkest hours. The end of Irene's life was quiet compared to its beginning. She spent her final years away from the glittering courts and battlefields that had defined her youth, living in reflection and devotion. Her later reputation was that of a pious and dignified widow who bore her misfortunes with patience. In an age when rulers were judged by their conquests, her greatest achievement was endurance itself. She left behind not monuments or victories, but lives that continued her legacy. Her descendants carried her blood into the royal houses of Europe, ensuring that her influence would persist even after the Hohenstaufen dynasty itself was extinguished. Irene's story also illuminates the fragility of power and the strength of character required to endure its loss. She witnessed the fall of empires, the murder of a husband, and the decline of her own health, yet she never yielded to despair. She embodied the quiet resilience that lies at the heart of true nobility. Her ability to adapt without losing her sense of self marks her as one of the most remarkable women of her age. Her life linked two worlds that were often in tension but always interconnected. Through her, the ideas, art, and traditions of Byzantium flowed into the courts of Western Europe. Through her children, those influences mingled with the ambitions of the Hohenstaufens, shaping the cultural landscape of the next generation. Her legacy, therefore, was not confined to a single realm but extended across continents, bridging the divides of language, religion, and custom. In the long view of history, Irene Angelina stands as both symbol and survivor. She represents the blending of East and West, the endurance of women amid dynastic turmoil, and the silent strength that sustains empires from within. Her story continues the thread woven by the women who came before her, Beatrice of Burgundy, Constance of Sicily, and prepares the stage for those who followed, whose courage would carry the Hohenstaufen name through triumph and ruin alike. Through her, the Hohenstaufen dynasty gained more than an heir. It gained a link to the timeless idea of empire that transcended geography and language. She brought to the turbulent courts of the West the memory of a world where power and learning were inseparable, where faith coexisted with reason, and where endurance was as noble as conquest. Her life, marked by exile and grace, revealed that even in an age ruled by men and swords, the fate of empires could depend on the wisdom of a woman who understood how to survive. Irene Angelina's journey was not one of conquest, but of continuity. From Byzantine princess to German queen, from wife to widow, she preserved dignity amid upheaval and left behind a legacy that outlasted both her birth empire and the one she married into. Her story completes the larger mosaic of Hohenstaufen women whose strength upheld their dynasty's greatness. Together they prove that power takes many forms, and that often the truest form of it is the ability to endure, to adapt, and to preserve what others would allow to perish. Isabella of England entered the story of the Hohenstaufen dynasty at a time when power, faith, and ambition shaped every alliance. Her life reflected the way royal women of the Middle Ages were bound by dynastic strategy and yet, through intelligence and presence, could influence events in ways that official records rarely capture. She was born into the Plantagenet family, one of the most formidable royal houses in Europe, and her marriage to Emperor Frederick, the ruler known for his intellect and authority, joined two great dynasties whose realms stretched across the known world. To understand Isabella's life is to see the delicate balance between duty and identity, between the visible grandeur of empire and the hidden costs of being a queen in a foreign land. Her journey followed those of women like Constance of Sicily and Irene Angelina, who each in their own way found themselves at the center of vast political networks, caught between power and vulnerability. Isabella was the daughter of King John of England, whose troubled reign was marked by conflict with his nobles and the church. Her early years were spent in the shadow of turmoil, but her upbringing was still that of a princess destined for diplomacy. She was educated in languages, music, and the courtly graces expected of a royal daughter, but behind her learning lay the understanding that her future would be shaped by marriage. For medieval princesses, marriage was rarely a matter of personal choice. It was a negotiation between kings, a bond forged to secure alliances and peace. Her value was measured by her lineage, her beauty, and the political advantages she could bring. By the time Isabella reached marriageable age, her brother Henry had become King of England, eager to strengthen his position in Europe after years of his father's instability. Across the continent, Emperor Frederick sought to consolidate his authority as both Holy Roman Emperor and King of Sicily. His empire stretched from the German lands through northern Italy to the rich and diverse kingdom of the south. Yet his relations with the papacy were tense, and his need for allies grew urgent. A union with the English royal house offered him legitimacy in the eyes of Western Europe and access to English wealth and prestige. The negotiations for Isabella's marriage were complex and drawn out, involving not only Frederick and Henry, but also the papacy, which had a vested interest in every move the emperor made. When the agreement was finally reached, it was a triumph of diplomacy. For England, the marriage promised peace and status. For the empire, it brought a connection to one of the oldest royal lines in Christendom. For Isabella, it marked the beginning of a journey that would take her far from the familiar landscapes of her youth into the glittering and often perilous world of the Sicilian court. Her departure from England was marked by ceremony and sorrow. Chroniclers recorded her beauty and grace as she left her homeland, escorted by nobles and envoys who carried gifts and dowries fit for an empress. The voyage across the seas to her new home was long and difficult, and her arrival in Italy was greeted with both curiosity and celebration. She was crowned Queen of the Romans in a grand ceremony that displayed the empire's wealth and power. For a young woman raised in the temperate courts of the north, the brilliance of southern Italy, its languages, colors, and customs, must have seemed both enchanting and overwhelming. Frederick was no ordinary monarch. His intellect, ambition, and independence made him one of the most remarkable figures of his age. He was known for his interest in science, philosophy, and law, and his court at Palermo was a center of learning that drew scholars from across the Mediterranean. He spoke several languages, corresponded with philosophers, and issued laws that sought to bring order and justice to his diverse empire. Yet he was also a man who demanded loyalty and control, whose political vision left little space for equals. Into this world stepped Isabella, an English princess accustomed to the traditions of her own court, but now expected to adapt to an emperor whose power extended far beyond what she had known. Their marriage was one of political convenience, but within that framework, Isabella found ways to assert quiet influence. She quickly learned the customs of her new realm and the complex etiquette of the imperial court. Surrounded by advisors, nobles, and scholars, she represented the link between the empire and her family in England. Her letters and envoys maintained contact with her brother's court, and through this correspondence, she acted as an informal ambassador. Her position allowed her to smooth relations between two powerful but often distant rulers. In a world where diplomacy was as much about tone and gesture as treaties, her presence carried symbolic weight. As an Englishwoman in a court filled with Italian, German, Arab, and Greek influences, Isabella's identity stood apart. Yet her foreignness also gave her a unique kind of freedom. She was both insider and outsider, married to the emperor, yet not fully of his world. This dual position allowed her to observe the political dynamics around her and to engage in them carefully. She was admired for her refinement, her modesty, and her intelligence. Chroniclers described her as gentle in manner, yet firm in spirit, capable of winning respect even in a court where authority was centered almost entirely in her husband's hands. Life in the imperial household was not without its challenges. Frederick's vast empire was in constant motion, and Isabella often accompanied him on his travels between Italy and Germany. The court moved like an army of administrators, scholars, and soldiers, reflecting the emperor's restless nature and his need to govern multiple lands. For Isabella, this life meant constant adjustment, new languages, new customs, and often uncertain security. Yet she adapted with grace, fulfilling her ceremonial duties and maintaining the dignity expected of an empress. Her influence was most visible in the realm of diplomacy and family alliances. Through her, Frederick strengthened his ties with the English crown, and their marriage reassured European rulers wary of the emperor's independence. She also played a part in courtly life, supporting religious and cultural projects that reflected her English upbringing and her Christian piety. It is said that she favored the founding of charitable institutions and supported chapels where Mass could be heard in the Latin rite familiar to her youth. Though overshadowed by her husband's larger-than-life presence, her contributions added a layer of grace and continuity to his reign. Her time in Sicily exposed her to the extraordinary cultural diversity that had flourished under the rule of her husband's mother, Constance of Sicily. In Palermo, Greek, Arabic, Latin, and Hebrew were spoken side by side, and the architecture reflected this blend of traditions. Isabella brought with her the manners of the English court, its music, its dress, and its traditions, and these mingled with the sophistication of the Sicilian world. In her person, the two cultures met, producing a subtle exchange that enriched both. Despite the outward splendor, Isabella's position was not without strain. Frederick's rule was often marked by conflict with the papacy, and the tension between empire and church affected every aspect of court life. The emperor's campaigns in Italy and his ambitions in the Crusader states kept him frequently away from his family. Isabella, left to manage her household and represent imperial dignity in his absence, bore these separations with patience. Yet the distance between them was more than physical. Frederick's mind was absorbed by politics and philosophy, while Isabella's world was shaped by family and faith. She bore him children, securing the continuation of the imperial line and further strengthening the alliance between their two realms. The birth of each child was celebrated as a sign of divine favor, for dynastic continuity was essential to the stability of the empire. As mother of imperial heirs, Isabella's status grew, and she gained respect even among those who saw her as an outsider. Her role as mother connected her to the long tradition of Hohenstaufen women who safeguarded the future through their sons and daughters. Her life, however, was touched by the same mixture of triumph and tragedy that seemed to mark all who belonged to the Hohenstaufen line. The pressures of imperial politics, the isolation of her position, and the demands placed upon her as both queen and mother took their toll. Far from the familiar landscapes of England, she faced the loneliness that came with being a foreign consort in a court dominated by powerful men. Yet even in this isolation, she preserved her dignity and faith. Her letters home reveal affection for her brother and nostalgia for her homeland, but they also reflect acceptance of her fate and pride in her role as empress. The later years of her marriage coincided with some of Frederick's greatest triumphs and fiercest conflicts. His disputes with the papacy reached new heights, leading to his excommunication and strained relations with Rome. In this climate of suspicion and hostility, Isabella's English connections were valuable. England's position, distant from papal control, offered the emperor a measure of diplomatic leverage. Through Isabella's quiet correspondence, channels of communication remained open even when official relations grew tense. In this way, she served as a bridge between worlds that often found themselves at odds. The end of Isabella's life came too soon. She died young, in childbirth, while still in the full bloom of her strength and beauty. Her death was mourned deeply in the imperial court, for it symbolized the loss of a bridge between two great realms. Frederick, though not known for open displays of emotion, ensured that her memory was honored with dignity. Her body was laid to rest in Palermo, near the tombs of earlier queens and emperors, uniting her forever with the land she had come to represent. Her legacy extended beyond her brief years as empress. Through her children, the English bloodline continued in the imperial family, reinforcing the connection between the Plantagenets and the Hohenstaufens. Her marriage, though arranged for political reasons, had far-reaching consequences. It symbolized the idea of a Europe linked by alliances rather than divided by constant war. Even if the peace it promised did not last, the attempt itself reflected the shared aspirations of an age when royal women served as the human bonds that held kingdoms together. Isabella's influence can be seen not in edicts or battles, but in the quieter realm of relationships. Her presence softened the emperor's image among Western rulers who viewed him as distant and domineering. She reminded them that beneath the armor of power lay the shared bonds of family and faith. Her example of grace under pressure and her ability to maintain dignity amid cultural difference gave her a kind of moral authority that transcended her official role. She also represents the enduring pattern of women in the Hohenstaufen story. Women who, though often overshadowed by the men whose crowns they helped sustain, proved indispensable to the dynasty's endurance. Like Beatrice of Burgundy, Constance of Sicily, and Irene Angelina, she embodied the fusion of strength and gentleness that allowed the empire to maintain continuity through crisis. Each of these women entered the Hohenstaufen world from different lands and cultures, yet all shared a capacity for adaptation and courage. Isabella's English background added a northern element to this tradition, linking the imperial family to the broader European sphere. Her story also reflects the personal costs of empire. The same union that symbolized peace between two powerful houses also demanded that she leave behind her identity and homeland. In fulfilling her duty, she sacrificed comfort and familiarity for a destiny that served a greater political purpose. Yet within that constraint, she found moments of agency. Her grace and diplomacy, her connection to England, and her ability to navigate the complex court of Frederick II gave her a subtle but enduring influence. In the centuries that followed, chroniclers remembered her with affection and respect. She was described as noble, virtuous, and wise beyond her years. Her marriage was recalled as one of the high points of European diplomacy, a symbol of unity amid the divisions of the age. Though her name did not echo as loudly as that of her husband, her contribution to the stability and prestige of his reign was undeniable. Her presence in Sicily also marked the continuing evolution of the island as a meeting place of cultures. The Norman, Arab, and Byzantine influences that shaped its character now absorbed an English element through her arrival. In this way, she contributed, even if indirectly, to the cultural richness that made Frederick's court famous. The architecture, art, and learning that flourished in his reign carried traces of the diverse traditions represented by his queens. The story of Isabella of England thus fits naturally into the continuum of Hohenstaufen women whose lives blended duty with quiet strength. Each faced a world that expected obedience yet demanded wisdom, and each left behind a legacy that extended beyond her own lifetime. Isabella's role as queen was brief but significant. She stood as a link between two worlds, the northern kingdom of her birth and the Mediterranean empire of her marriage. And in that role, she gave meaning to the idea of unity amid diversity. Her life, though marked by distance and loss, reflected a form of influence that cannot be measured in power alone. She taught by example that grace, patience, and integrity could sustain a dynasty as surely as armies and laws. Her memory endures not only in the annals of political history, but in the quiet acknowledgement that the strength of empires often rested on the shoulders of women whose names were spoken softly, but whose impact was lasting. In the broader story of the Hohenstaufen legacy, Isabella's presence represents the moment when the empire reached beyond the Mediterranean to embrace the northern world. Her union with Frederick united two lines that embodied the spirit of medieval Europe, ambitious, learned, and deeply intertwined. Through her, the English and German traditions met, and though her life was brief, her influence endured through her children, her correspondence, and the cultural bridges she helped build. The memory of Isabella of England completes a lineage of extraordinary women who defined the human side of imperial power. From Beatrice to Constance, from Irene to Isabella, each embodied resilience, intellect, and grace under pressure. They were the silent architects of continuity in a dynasty often defined by its wars and ambitions. Isabella's story, like theirs, reminds us that empire is not built only by the will of emperors, but also by the hearts and minds of those who walked beside them. She entered the Hohenstaufen world as a political pawn, yet she left it as a queen whose influence lingered long after her voice was gone, proving that even in the most constrained circumstances, a woman's strength could shape the fate of an empire. Throughout the long and dramatic history of the Hohenstaufen dynasty, the names most often remembered are those of kings and emperors whose deeds filled chronicles and reshaped Europe. Yet behind and beside these men stood a network of women whose presence gave the dynasty its endurance, its continuity, and much of its strength. These women rarely ruled in name, yet they influenced decisions that shaped realms, brokered alliances that changed the balance of power, and preserved dynastic stability in moments of chaos. After the lives of Constance of Sicily, Irene Angelina, and Isabella of England, the story of the Hohenstaufen women continues through others less frequently remembered, but no less essential. They were duchesses, countesses, abbesses, and patrons who, through their marriages and management, extended the reach of the family far beyond the imperial court. To understand their world is to grasp how power in the Middle Ages was never truly confined to thrones or crowns, but flowed through the choices and resilience of women who acted quietly yet decisively. Among these figures, Agnes of Hohenstaufen, Duchess of Austria, stands as one of the most striking examples. She was born into the heart of the Hohenstaufen line, a niece to emperors and a link between generations. Her marriage to Duke Frederick of Austria was no mere personal union, but a deliberate political bond meant to stabilize relations between the empire and the Babenberg dynasty that ruled Austria at the time. This marriage reflected the constant strategy of the Hohenstaufens, to bind powerful families through alliances that transformed potential rivals into kin. Agnes, intelligent and well-educated, understood this function from the moment of her betrothal. Yet her influence extended far beyond serving as a symbol of peace. As Duchess, she assumed a vital role in regional governance, especially during periods when her husband's duties kept him occupied with imperial affairs. In medieval Austria, the Duchess often managed estates, dispensed patronage, and oversaw the welfare of both religious and lay communities. Agnes proved adept at this work, establishing herself as a respected figure among the local nobility. Her reputation for fairness in judgment and generosity toward the church earned her admiration that survived long after her death. Through donations to monasteries and the foundation of chapels, she strengthened the spiritual authority of her family while also embedding its presence in the cultural landscape of the region. These acts were not merely displays of piety, but also instruments of influence, for the support of religious institutions served to consolidate territorial control and reinforce dynastic prestige. Agnes's life also reveals how Hohenstaufen women often balanced competing loyalties. Though bound by blood to the imperial house, she lived among the Austrian nobility, whose interests did not always align with those of her cousins in Germany or Italy. She learned to mediate between them, a role that demanded both diplomacy and discretion. Through her efforts, the uneasy relations between the emperor and the Babenberg rulers eased, at least temporarily. Her children inherited claims that would later play a part in shaping Central European politics, ensuring that the Hohenstaufen influence lingered even after direct power had waned. Agnes was not alone in shaping the fortunes of her house. The dynasty's daughters and sisters married into nearly every noble family of importance across the continent, turning kinship into a web of alliances that stretched from the Rhine to the Danube, from Burgundy to Bohemia. One such figure was Gertrude of Hohenstaufen, whose marriage to Duke Henry the Lion of Saxony connected two powerful but often rival houses. Although their union was marked by political tension, Gertrude's role as intermediary softened conflicts that might otherwise have erupted into open war. She embodied the model of the noblewoman as peacemaker, a position that required intelligence and restraint. Through her, the competing ambitions of emperor and duke were at least partially reconciled, and her descendants carried forward the blended legacy of both lines. Beyond the sphere of marriage, some Hohenstaufen women found power within the church. Medieval convents were not merely places of retreat, but centers of learning, art, and influence. Noble women who entered religious life often maintained extensive connections with secular rulers, acting as advisors or guardians of family interests. One example was Agnes's cousin, also named Agnes, who became abbess of the convent at Gandersheim, a position that combined spiritual authority with real economic and political power. As abbess, she controlled vast estates, supervised the education of noble girls, and preserved the intellectual traditions of her house. Through her, the Hohenstaufens extended their reach into ecclesiastical spheres, ensuring that their name was associated not only with kingship but with scholarship and faith. The cultural patronage of Hohenstaufen women also helped shape the character of their age. They were often the sponsors of poets, chroniclers, and artists whose works defined the era's artistic identity. The courtly literature of the 12th and 13th centuries, rich with tales of honor, love, and virtue, owed much to the encouragement of noble women who valued education and refinement. In Austria, Agnes's influence can be traced in the flourishing of vernacular poetry and music. Her court welcomed troubadours and scholars who carried with them the styles and ideas that would later dominate German and Central European culture. Through her patronage, the intellectual life of the region deepened, bridging the Latin traditions of the Church with the emerging literature of the people. Another noteworthy figure within the extended Hohenstaufen family was Beatrice of Swabia, daughter of Emperor Philip of Swabia. Her marriage to Otto of Brunswick, who would later become King of Germany, represented an extraordinary moment in the volatile politics of the time. The union between the Hohenstaufen and Welf houses, long bitter enemies, was seen as a symbolic reconciliation between two dynasties that had divided the empire for generations. Beatrice's marriage was brief, for she died young, but her role in that fleeting peace demonstrates how the women of her family were used to heal wounds that no treaty could mend. Her personal grace and reputation for kindness softened the image of both houses, showing that diplomacy could take a human form. Even those Hohenstaufen women, whose lives unfolded far from imperial centers, contributed in subtle but lasting ways. Through dowries, property management, and patronage, they brought prosperity to regions that might otherwise have remained peripheral. Many administered estates with skill that rivaled their male counterparts, ensuring that income flowed to sustain armies and courts. Others acted as regents for sons too young to rule, as Constance of Sicily had done for Frederick. In these roles, they displayed political acuity that challenged contemporary assumptions about women's capacity for governance. Their influence also extended into law and custom. The presence of strong duchesses and countesses in Hohenstaufen lands helped shape expectations of noble conduct. Through their decisions in matters of inheritance, they reinforced the principles of property transmission that underpinned feudal stability. In some cases, their interventions preserved family unity during disputes that might otherwise have split territories apart. The careful balance of power between husbands and wives in estate management, often negotiated through written charters and mutual oaths, reveals the practical equality that could exist beneath the formal hierarchies of the age. Religious devotion formed another dimension of their authority. Hohenstaufen women frequently acted as mediators between church and state, using their influence to obtain pardons, secure appointments, or promote reforms. Their donations to monasteries were often accompanied by specific conditions ensuring prayers for their families and protection for their dependents. This spiritual patronage reinforced their moral standing and created a legacy of sanctity that bolstered the dynasty's image. Some were remembered as almost saintly figures, their lives celebrated in local legends long after the empire itself had faded. Agnes of Hohenstaufen's example illustrates the delicate balance these women maintained between personal piety and political necessity. Her support of monastic institutions was genuine, yet she also understood that the church's endorsement strengthened her husband's authority. By promoting education and charity, she cultivated loyalty among both clergy and common people. Her approach reflected a broader pattern among Hohenstaufen women. They used religious patronage as both a moral act and a tool of governance. The cultural achievements associated with these women often rivaled those of their male kin. Under their influence, courts became centers of poetry, art, and learning. The architectural projects they sponsored, churches, abbeys, and castles, stood as tangible expressions of dynastic ambition and devotion. Many of these structures survive today, bearing silent witness to their vision. Their patronage encouraged the spread of Gothic art and the preservation of earlier Romanesque traditions, blending innovation with continuity. What makes these women remarkable is not only the scope of their activity, but the intelligence with which they navigated their constrained circumstances. Medieval society defined their roles narrowly, yet they found space to act with independence and foresight. Their marriages may have been arranged, but they turned them into partnerships of influence. Their households served as centers of administration, diplomacy, and culture. In letters, charters, and chronicles, their voices appear as counselors, advocates, and negotiators, shaping outcomes behind the scenes. The story of the lesser-known Hohenstaufen women also reveals how gender and power intersected in ways that challenge modern assumptions about the Middle Ages. Far from being passive, these women were integral to the functioning of the political system. They exercised what historians often call soft power, a form of influence grounded in relationships, reputation, and persuasion rather than direct command. Yet their power was no less real. Without their interventions, many of the alliances that sustained the empire would have collapsed under the weight of male rivalry and ambition. Their significance becomes clearer when viewed in the context of the dynasty's eventual decline. As the Hohenstaufen line faced growing opposition from the papacy, from regional princes, and from within its own ranks, the bonds of family became more fragile. In this environment, the women's role as unifiers grew even more important. They maintained correspondence between distant branches, arranged marriages that sought to preserve loyalty, and worked to protect the family's younger members from exile or execution. After the fall of Frederick's line, several Hohenstaufen women continued to live in the courts of allies, keeping alive the memory of their house. Through them, the spirit of the dynasty endured even after its political power was broken. Their patronage of learning ensured that the intellectual legacy of the Hohenstaufen world did not vanish. Manuscripts copied in monasteries, they founded preserved works of theology, law, and poetry that would later inform Renaissance thought. Their attention to education for both sons and daughters set standards that spread through noble families across Europe. The cultural flowering that characterized Frederick's court owed much to foundations laid by earlier generations of women who valued literacy and the arts. The network of Hohenstaufen women also contributed to the transmission of ideas between different regions. Through their marriages, they carried customs, languages, and artistic styles from one court to another. An English princess introduced northern traditions into Sicily. A German duchess brought imperial culture to Austria. An Italian countess introduced southern refinement into Burgundy. These exchanges shaped the texture of medieval civilization far beyond what political boundaries suggest. Each marriage was both a personal union and a cultural bridge. Agnes of Hohenstaufen's descendants continued this pattern, spreading the family's influence into Hungary, Bohemia, and Poland. Through them, the ideals and traditions of the Hohenstaufen world penetrated the courts of Eastern Europe, linking them to the broader Western tradition. Even when their male kin lost power, the women's alliances preserved fragments of that unity. Their stories remind us that history's great transformations often begin in the private sphere, in the choices made by individuals navigating the intersection of duty and desire. By looking closely at these women, it becomes clear that the Hohenstaufen legacy was not only a matter of empire and law, but also of human connection. The duchesses and countesses who managed estates, the abbesses who ruled spiritual communities, and the queens who mediated between rival courts all contributed to the stability and identity of the dynasty. They formed the quiet backbone of a political system that depended on loyalty, communication, and cultural coherence. Without them, the emperor's ambitions might have remained grand but hollow dreams. The memory of these women deserves restoration to its rightful place in history. They were not merely supporters of male authority, but active participants in shaping their world. Their strength lay in adaptability, the ability to move between cultures, languages, and loyalties without losing integrity. In their actions, we see the foundations of what we now call diplomacy and cultural stewardship. They remind us that power is not always visible, that influence can operate through empathy and intellect as effectively as through command. When the Hohenstaufen dynasty finally fell, the empire fragmented, and its monuments became ruins, but the spirit that had animated it persisted in the works these women inspired and the traditions they upheld. Their foundations continued to educate, their churches continued to pray, and their descendants continued to govern under the principles they had helped establish. The dynasty's fall was political. Its legacy, however, was human, sustained by the quiet perseverance of those who had held it together in life. To reflect on their story is to see the Middle Ages not as an age of rigid hierarchies, but as a living network of relationships in which women played indispensable roles. Agnes of Hohenstaufen and her peers were neither silent figures nor mere ornaments of power. They were strategists, patrons, and builders of bridges, between kingdoms, between faith and politics, between past and future. Their efforts shaped the destiny of Europe as surely as the decrees of emperors. The Hohenstaufen women stand as a testament to the resilience of human will amid the constraints of history. They prove that influence need not shout to be lasting, that the strength of a dynasty lies as much in its daughters as in its sons. Through their marriages, their faith, and their intellect, they carried forward the ideals of unity and civilization that defined their age. Even when the empire faded, their legacy endured in the culture they nurtured and the connections they forged. The dynasty's story, when told through their lives, gains depth and balance. It becomes not merely a chronicle of wars and emperors, but a narrative of endurance, grace, and intelligence. These women, often unsung, were the true power brokers of their world, guiding the tides of history with quiet determination. Their legacy invites us to look beyond thrones and titles to see the human foundations of power, the hands that built, the hearts that endured, and the minds that shaped the medieval world into something greater than its borders. Through them, the Hohenstaufen name remains not just a symbol of imperial grandeur, but a reminder of the profound and lasting influence of women whose strength defined an age.